Well, welcome to Chapter 19, which is Global Change, the final lecture of the year. Yay! So one reason why this chapter is so important is because it's not only a scientific issue, but a major political issue as well. And so it's important to try to understand some of the science that supports it, global change, so you can be a more informed citizen later as you are making changes in legislation. So global change is any chemical, biological, or physical property change of the planet. Examples include cold temperatures causing ice ages and warmer temperatures causing greenhouse ages, which is what we are currently in. Global climate change, obviously the change in climate of the Earth, and global warming is one aspect of climate change, which is the warming of the oceans, land masses, and atmosphere of the Earth. The greenhouse effect is a real phenomenon on Earth that's actually good for the planet. And I think some people sometimes get those two confused, the greenhouse effect and global warming. Greenhouse effect we need to keep our Earth's temperature at a stable 57 degrees Fahrenheit. Otherwise, we would be at 0 degrees without the greenhouse effect. So what's going on in the greenhouse effect? When sunlight comes from, or excuse me, radiation from the sun hits the Earth, it's got visible light and UV light. One third is reflected back into space. Some of that UV radiation is absorbed by the ozone, which we like. We like the ozone in the stratosphere to absorb that UV, and strikes the Earth where it's converted to low energy infrared radiation. So high energy UV strikes the Earth and gets re-radiated back back from the Earth into lower energy infrared. We don't see infrared, but we feel it as heat. So for example, when you're walking down the street and you can feel the heat coming out from the asphalt. Asphalt is dark, it has a lower albedo, therefore it is going to absorb and radiate more heat. The infrared radiation then goes back towards the atmosphere where it gets absorbed by the greenhouse gases. Those greenhouse gases trap heat and then end up re-radiating that infrared back to the Earth. So as this heat is cycling between the atmosphere to the Earth, back into the atmosphere, back to the Earth, we have the greenhouse effect. So this diagram is showing you um, that process of greenhouse effect. So do make sure that you understand what processes are going on. So the greenhouse gases we do need in our atmosphere in order to produce this greenhouse effect. The problem is coming from human activities that is increasing the amount of greenhouse gases. So the 6 greenhouse gases are water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, ozone, and CFCs. Please note that CFCs are the only exclusively human um, designed or made greenhouse gas. All the rest exist or can exist in nature. Um, the different gases will differ in their ability to absorb radiation and how persistent they are in the atmosphere. So notice that water vapor has a very short persistence period. So water vapor, although it can trap the most heat, which that might be a test question, which greenhouse gas traps the most heat, it is water. But because it doesn't stay in the atmosphere very long, it is not as harmful as the others. So carbon dioxide um, can vary, and many things influence the fluctuations in carbon dioxide, which we'll talk about. Methane stays in the air a lot longer than carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide is much longer than methane, although there's not as much in the atmosphere. And then chlorofluorocarbons, which were discussed in Chapter 15, Air Pollution, are the worst offenders of greenhouse gases because they trap heat, but then they stay in the atmosphere for very long periods of time. So, natural ways of having these greenhouse gases present in the atmosphere. We get a lot of carbon dioxide from the eruption of volcanoes. And we have seen in chapter 15 how volcanoes can also shoot up large quantities of ash, sulfur dioxide, and water vapor as well, and can cause short term climate change. And the example they give in your book was Mount Pinatubo, which erupted in 1991, caused the global temperature to decrease by almost a whole degree just from that one eruption event. And so, um, the amount, if the temperature is declining, then the amount of particulates and or gases can vary as well. Methane can come from decomposition. And remember, in well, we'll talk about that in a second. But dead organic matter is what is ultimately converted into carbon dioxide. So when you have a lot of dead matter, um, it'll change to carbon dioxide. But if there's not oxygen, those are anaerobic conditions, then uh, carbon dioxide is not produced and methane is. We saw that in the landfill chapter, where in landfills, methane gas is produced when the trash is decomposing with no oxygen. Wetlands are actually the number one natural source of methane. But on the other hand, wetlands are um, decreasing because of development. So humans are taking away the wetlands. Also, naturally, and it doesn't say that on the slide, is from digestion of animals, which is actually the number one reason for methane. When animals consume plants, they have to have bacteria to digest that cellulose in that plant material. Um, so the bacteria that's in their digestive tract don't have oxygen. So again, there's anaerobic conditions, methane is produced. And so as they say in your textbook, termites are actually the second largest natural source of methane, which you wouldn't think. Nitrous oxide comes from denitrification. Denitrification also occurs in low oxygen environments. So you see it in wetlands, lakes, oceans, and in those environments, nitrate is converted to nitrous oxide gas and then enters the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas. But it's not as abundant as some of the others. And then water vapor is actually the most abundant, and I said it it traps the most heat, but because it doesn't stay in the atmosphere very long, um, it's not as harmful as the others can potentially be. So now we move on to anthropogenic sources. These are the causes from human activities. Burning of fossil fuels. We already know that whenever a fuel combusts, any combustion, carbon dioxide is released. So the more burning of fuels we do, the more CO2 is released. In agricultural practices, methane is also produced. And again, um, especially in areas like China, where they deliberately flood the area when they want to cultivate rice crops, so much water leads to a lack of oxygen. And so that's going to start to produce methane. It could produce nitrous oxide. Also, if you have man-made fertilizers, um, those can create an excess of nitrates. So, and then again with the livestock and their digestion, basically cow farts add to a lot of methane on Earth, which again traps a lot more heat than CO2. So really if there was another reason to become vegetarian or at least cut down on meat, it is because the contribution of the livestock to the greenhouse gas methane. Deforestation. We already know that cutting down trees and not replanting them is going to be an issue on many different levels. Generally, trees remove the CO2 from the atmosphere, and decomposing trees that have died will add CO2. So generally, there is a balance because the inputs equal the outputs. But when you cut down the trees and you don't replant them or replace them, then you have a net increase in the CO2. Landfills, as I already just mentioned, contribute to methane, and then industrial productions of refrigerants that we use in, well, refrigerators and air conditioners contain CFCs. So CFCs are produced in industrial production or manufacturing. If you remember from chapter 15, the Montreal Protocol phased out the production of use of CFCs. So they're basically banned, but in many developing countries, they're still in use. And unfortunately, a lot of the alternatives that they came up with are less harmful, but they still have great warming potential. So now those, the hydrochlorofluorocarbons or HCFCs, um, are being phased out and should be phased out by 2030. This is just showing you the anthropogenic sources of greenhouse gases. And this is showing you the major contributors of those top three. So notice that with methane, it comes from livestock and from landfills. From nitrous oxide, it's from soils that usually contain man-made fertilizers and extra manure. And then from carbon dioxide, a huge majority from fossil fuels and burning fossil fuels. So now we can look, is the Earth really getting warmer because of greenhouse gases? And if so, is it really humans that have um, made that speed up? What we have noticed in the past from scientific uh, analysis is that Earth has gone through many periods of change in climate. There's an ice age, and then there's a greenhouse age, and then there's an ice age. So it has fluctuated, and you'll see that in a second. But the question is, has it become a greenhouse age now quicker as far as CO2 concentrations? So there was a scientist, David Keeling, who went out to Hawaii and was recording CO2 concentrations starting in 1958 and uh, and continued to do it into the 2000s, him and his students. When it exactly ended, I don't know. I'd have to look that up. But what he noticed after just a year was that CO2 actually varied seasonally. So you can see the purple line as it goes up and down. And in fact, this graph is very popular on the AP exam, so be familiar with it. So the CO2 would fluctuate seasonally, but overall it increased throughout the years. So that's what he noticed. So what would cause the seasonal variation? Well, what happens in the spring when those trees come out and turn green, they increase their absorption, so taking in of CO2 from the atmosphere so that they can carry out photosynthesis. Also in the spring, the water begins to warm up, algae and plants start to photosynthesize, and so they also take CO2 from the atmosphere. But in the fall, when leaves start to drop, crops start to be harvested, bodies of water start to cool, then how much CO2 is being taken from the algae and plants decreases, and the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere will start to increase. And so it was just a more dramatic change when you add in the fact of humans and the Industrial Revolution on a historical level. This is showing you that the biggest emitters of CO2 come from China and United States is second. China unfortunately did not sign the Kyoto Protocol, was not required to because it was considered a developing country and developing countries didn't have to do that. But since that protocol, China has moved up as far as building their factories, generating more electricity, and contributing intensely to air pollution and carbon dioxide emissions. So jumped way ahead of the United States. But then again, if you look at the per capita, United States is still second. So we only have 2% of the world's population, 2, but we use almost 20%, or we contribute almost 20% of the carbon dioxide emissions, and that's not good. But if you look on the per capita, you'll see China is pretty down there because of their huge population. They're not individually consuming or emitting CO2. So this is showing global temperature since 1880. And since 1880, the temperature has increased zero point 0.8 degrees Celsius. And that's an average because some areas have become cooler. Some areas, generally in water bodies, have had no change. And then some areas are warmer. 9 of the 10 warmest years on record occurred from 2000 to 2009. So that was the warmest decade on record. And that should be very concerning to not only scientists but politicians who don't believe in global warming, because it it just doesn't sound logical that between 2000 and 2009 you have 9 of the 10 warmest years on record. That doesn't sound like a natural occurrence. But um, almost 1 degree doesn't sound like a lot if you're looking at 130 years. But the fact that it has increased has shown that humans have had a contribution. This is showing the relative differences to the average temperature from 51 to 80. So in the US, it was between zero point 0.5 and 1 degree difference in 30 years. Now, again, that doesn't sound like a big difference, but it is. Because remember, if you think of in terms of geologic time are such huge expanses of time. And when we're talking that in a human lifetime, the global temperature has increased by almost a degree in one human lifetime, that is very significant. So, even though it's possible that changes in temperature could be natural, you want to see if those kinds of changes are typical. So what they did was they examined um, indirectly the temperatures of the past. One way was to look at foraminifera species. These are um, marine organisms that have shells, and they get deposited on the ocean floor when they die. And so they build up and add to the sediment on the ocean floor. What's good about them is that different types of foraminifera prefer different water temperatures. So if they get a layer of certain species, they can basically tell generally what the ocean temperature was at that time, and so get a good idea of what the climate was like. Also, they can go and take ice cores. So as you can see in the picture, they take a pipe, drill it into the ice, and take out the ice, and they analyze it. And as snowfall starts to compact, you form ice. What also happens is that the ice will capture air bubbles, and those air bubbles come from the atmosphere of that time. So what they'll do is they'll take a little piece of the ice core, melt it, and figure out the concentrations of the different greenhouse gases within it to determine how much greenhouse gas was in the atmosphere at that time. They also look at oxygen isotopes. O16 is considered light, and heavy oxygen would be O18. So if you look at the change in percentage of heavy oxygen in the different layers of the ice core, you can basically estimate temperatures from even hundreds of thousands of years ago, which is really cool. And so what they had noticed was that when they had analyzed the last 400,000 years, the atmosphere never contained more than 300 parts per million of CO2. But in the last 60 years, the concentration of CO2 went from 310 to 390 in 60 years. But the 400,000 years before that, it never went over 300. That to me is quite startling. And yet, some politicians are still not convinced that humans are having a direct and harmful influence on the global environment, the global atmosphere. And it wasn't only CO2 that increased, methane and nitrous oxide also increased. And that would make sense in terms of methane as more people have become on the planet, which is probably the number one environmental issue to tackle first is population growth, because population growth leads to more factories being built, more people to feed, so more fossil fuels being burned, more agriculture being harvested, more animals being raised, which leads to more methane and more nitrous oxide from fertilizers. What they had noticed as well was that after 1800, all three gas all three gases concentrations rose dramatically, which totally coincides with the Industrial Revolution. So, what do we know from the science? Well, we know that an increase in CO2 causes a greater capacity for warming because CO2 can trap more heat. So, the more CO2 that's in the atmosphere, the more heat that gets trapped and re radiated back to the Earth. It's not rocket science. When the Earth has higher temperatures, the oceans will start to warm and then cannot contain as much CO2 gas. Because remember, colder fluids will hold more gas. So as a result, warmer waters will release more CO2. When you are cutting down trees and not replanting them, there's a net increase of CO2. So it's a number of things that contribute to CO2. Um, And scientists find that the patterns in temperature change are strongly consistent and correlate with increased greenhouse gases like CO2 and nitrous oxide and methane, and not consistent with just increased solar radiation. This is just showing you how temperature, as it has gone up and down over the last 400,000 years, so did concentrations of CO2. This is showing you how, let's see if I can move this up a little bit, what scientists predict, there we go, will happen to global temperatures if there's a low increase in CO2, and you can attribute that to mostly human activities, B, a moderate amount increase in CO2, and C, a high increase. So by 2100, if there was a lot more CO2 emitted, we could go up as much as 8 degrees. That is very, there are lots of consequences for much higher temperatures. When you talk about feedback loops, you always need to know for the AP exam about the different feedback loops. For the positive feedback loop system, if you have higher levels of CO2, they trap more heat. That's going to lead to higher temperatures. If you have higher temperatures, that will cause decomposition to occur faster. Decomposition faster, which in aerobic conditions, which means it has oxygen, decomposition leads to carbon dioxide. If there's not any oxygen, it leads to methane. So if you have oxygen and you have more decomposition, then you have more CO2 added to the atmosphere. You have more CO2 added to the atmosphere, it's going to get hotter. It gets hotter, you're going to have more decomposition, and so on. With a negative feedback system, negative feedback loop means that you're switching the direction in which something is going. So again, a lot of people keep getting confused with negative and positive feedback loops as negative and positive as in good and bad. And it's not that way. Positive feedback loops mean it just keeps perpetuating itself in the same direction. And it could be a good thing or a bad thing. Negative feedback loop says that it's going in one direction but then stops and goes the other way. So like your thermostat. As the temperature rises, then the thermostat will kick on to cool it off, which means it will reverse itself. So, in a negative feedback loop, increased plant growth um, increases the uptake of CO2 from the atmosphere. So, more plants take CO2 out of the atmosphere, which is good. So, that's a negative feedback loop system. Consequences of to the environment because of global warming. The melting of the polar ice caps in Greenland and Antarctica. There could be a positive as far as if those ice sheets broke apart, that could add more waterways for boats to go through, but I don't think that that's a good enough reason. Um, the melting of glaciers around the world. Um, Glacier National Park used to have 150 glaciers in 1850 and today only has 25. And by 2030, it's expected to not have any more glaciers. And that's a really bad thing. And as well as it's melting, you don't have that source of water there. And so dependence on water could be an issue there too. Melting of permafrost. Permafrost is the frozen land that we see up in the tundra. If that starts to melt, you might see landslides. Um, Other organic matter that was trapped under the ice will start to decompose, and that decomposition can either lead to carbon dioxide if there's oxygen or methane if there's not enough. So, either way, that's going to contribute to more greenhouse gases being emitted. Rising of sea levels due to that melting. Oh, and one more thing about the melting polar ice cap. If you look at page 536 in your book, you'll see a picture of the ice cap near the North Pole, which is 39% smaller since the year that I was born, 1979, to the year 2000. So in 21 years, it shrank almost 40%. That is uh, devastating and crazy how fast that happened. So rising of sea levels. Obviously, lots of people live by the coastlines, and some live very close to the 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 actual, coastline. And so, obviously, raising sea levels, which it has risen 9 inches um, in the last several years, and rising sea levels more will reduce will increase flooding, and some cities may be underwater. They predict that if sea level keeps rising at the current rate it is, that Florida will be underwater completely. Heat waves. If you have not noticed that there have been some crazy weather patterns and climate patterns, you can't help but try to at least put together some of it with global warming. There was a huge heat wave in Chicago a couple of years ago where a lot of elderly people passed away from heat stroke because they did not have fans or air conditioners in their homes, because generally places like Chicago don't need that. We need those here in San Antonio, but they don't in Chicago. And so a lot of people died. Other places might have cold spells since there are freaky weather and climate patterns, but not as many cold spells. Um, Precipitation patterns. Precipitation patterns, if you remember, are heaviest at the equator because there's more intense sunlight that falls there. More sunlight means more evaporation, which leads to lower pressures, and that leads to rain. So, um, if you have different pressure patterns and temperature patterns, then it's very logical to assume that those precipitation patterns might change. So, and you can't necessarily predict what will happen because that could be deserts actually get more rain than usual, but they could also get less. And same with the rainforest. They could totally decrease in the amount of rain, which would really kill off a lot of their species, or it could have an increase in rain. You just don't know. Increase in storm intensity. That one is, I believe, directly related to global warming because, especially in terms of hurricanes, we have had in the last several years more hurricanes and tropical storms than I think ever before. And tropical storms and hurricanes need warm water to feed itself because once it hits land, then it dies, or once it hits a body of cold water, it dies. So the reason why Katrina in 2005 was so strong was because the Gulf of Mexico was unusually warm, and so that fed into that huge hurricane. Um, and so if ocean waters are getting warmer, the potential for larger hurricanes um, will be there. Shift in ocean currents. That is a consequence that has not happened yet, which I know is a question on your EOC. If you remember from, I don't remember what chapter, but it was talking about ocean circulation, and we have the nice warm Gulf Stream that comes from the Gulf of Mexico, and it travels upward to the North Atlantic where it will start to sink because of the cold water. So it sinks, it turns cold, it travels through the oceans, and so you have this circulation of areas that have more or less heat and areas that have more or less salinity. But when you have the melting ice caps and you have increased sea level rise, those melting ice caps will add fresh water into the ocean water, which will dilute the salinity, and that could totally mess up ocean currents. And ocean currents are also a moderator of climates. The cold California current is what keeps California so cool year round, and the warm ocean current of the Gulf Stream is what keeps London so warm compared to what it could be if that current wasn't there. This is showing you the glaciers. This is showing you changes in sea level. Living organisms obviously can be affected. Um, if a certain species cannot adapt to climate change, then they will not survive. If they are not mobile and able to move, they will not survive. And in fact, global climate change is the number one reason for mass extinctions of the past. The Great Permian extinction 245 million years ago is believed to have been caused from global climate change, and that so many species could not adapt and could not move. Um, if global climate change occurred, humans might have to relocate, and that would depend on where you lived in the first place. Other problems could be mosquitoes. You know, they like heat, they like moisture. Those kinds of population of pests could increase, which could also increase the carrying of disease and pathogens. Um, there could be economic consequences for, here if it got warmer, then our electric bills get worse, and so on. The controversy is that um, it's not among scientists. Scientists agree that greenhouse gas concentrations are increasing and this is leading to global warming. The problem is in the politicians because they don't want to say, yes, greenhouse gases are increasing because of human input and it's humans that are causing the earth to get warmer because they think that it could be more natural. But they're still not doing much. Excuse me. The federal government doesn't want to do a whole lot to control that. I won't go through this chart specifically, but you want to take a look and just see what the IPCC said at the 2007 assessment as far as the likely changes that have occurred and that will occur. The Kyoto Protocol was the piece of political, I don't want to say legislation because it's not officially legislation, but a political meeting in 1997 about how to best control global warming emissions. And the agreement was that emissions would be reduced to 5.2% below their 1990 levels by 2012. So that's 2 years ago. Developing nations, unfortunately, did not have emission limits imposed because supposedly they contributed so much less than developed countries. It was really up to the developed countries to make the big changes. Unfortunately, because that did not include China, China had no reason to try to limit their emissions on anything and became the worst polluter and the worst user of coal, which is again the dirtiest fossil fuel to burn. Um, Vice President Al Gore signed it at the time because in 1997 he was in office, but it was never ratified by the Senate, therefore not legally binding. And the president didn't push for it, Bill Clinton at the time, because he knew it wasn't going to go through. The Democrats were more okay with global warming, and Republicans traditionally do not agree with global warming. When it was time in, I think, 2001, when President Bush could have modified it, excuse me, when the Kyoto was modified in 2001, he could have ratified it, but he chose not to because he said that there was too much uncertainty in these predictions. But he also said that all countries should be subject to emission limits, including China and India, which apparently still were not included. Since then, though, other areas, mayors of cities in the U.S., Governor Schwarzenegger of California at the time, have implemented their own laws about emission standards. Certain companies have kind of stepped up, like General Electric, GE have stepped up and invested billions to try to reduce their emissions. So some are doing it on their own levels without the help of the federal government. But the federal government really does need to get involved. In 2009, the EPA said that it would start regulating greenhouse gases, and then Obama in 2010 said that they really needed to look at carbon dioxide. So that's when they started with the automobile manufacturers who had to reduce their CO2 emissions by 2016 and make more fuel efficient cars. So it, we're starting and we're getting there, but it's not nearly where it needs to be. Carbon sequestration was just a way of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and trying to store it somewhere else or pump it back into the ocean. The technology is still too new and too expensive. So as of right now, it's not a big um, way to handle getting rid of carbon dioxide. All right, that's the end of chapter 19.